Everyone, welcome back for our agriculture flip video number 3. We're going to cover this essential question over 2 separate flip videos, with the essential question being, how does agriculture vary over space? In other words, if we're looking at the spatial distribution of the world, we're going to see how agriculture is different, particularly in the most developed countries of the world versus least developed countries of the world. So generally speaking, agriculture is one of the most defining differences between what makes an MDC and what makes an LDC. Or I should rephrase that as what makes a country a most developed country versus a less developed country. Makes perfect sense if we consider that effective agriculture essentially frees up your labor force. It frees people from having to worry about feeding themselves and enables them to then pursue other economic activities, which we discussed already when we talked about agriculture being a primary versus secondary and tertiary activity. So, in LECs, more people are obviously involved in primary economic activities. In a least developed country, you have more people who are working on feeding themselves and feeding those around them. Whereas in MDCs, when you have more successful farming, more people, as I mentioned, can be involved in those secondary and tertiary activities. LDCs primarily engage in subsistence agriculture. So for the most part, LDCs are focusing upon, they have the technological and developmental capacity to feed themselves and their families for the most part. And let me also just pause myself there. These are some broad strokes generalizations. So I want to make sure that I'm speaking in general patterns, or it's clear that I'm speaking in general patterns, but there are a tremendous number of exceptions to these rules. And most developed countries primarily engage in commercial agriculture, so producing surplus goods and enough to be sold off the farm. MDCs also are defined by their use of industrial agriculture. So if we're going to loop this back to the second agricultural revolution, MDCs primarily use the technology available to them to ensure that they are producing agriculture at high yields of agriculture. What this has led to is industrial agriculture is a little bit different than the term I'm about to use, so I am differentiating them. Industrial agriculture, I want you to focus on the extensive use of technology, whereas agribusiness is going to be focused upon the agribusinesses are a term used to describe commercial agriculture, where there is one business that essentially owns all steps of production. Here's what I mean. I'm going to go to a graphic, I'm coming back. Imagine an agribusiness is a business that owns seed to market. They own the farms. They are the employers of the farmers themselves. Often they own the seeds. They own the plants, the type of seed that's being grown. They then have transportation companies that they own. They then have sort of manufacturing. So let's say you've got crops that are harvested but then need to be manufactured in some way. They'll own that, and then they will own the transportation again to take that to market. So you can kind of see this general chain here. I like the middle one the most in the sense of they've got research and development. So a lot of these agribusinesses are working on developing higher yield seeds, genetically modified crops that can be better, more pest resistant crops. They're going to own the industries to produce those crops, and then they're going to help sell those crops. So agribusinesses are the companies of most developed countries. And then let's go back to that definition. They're commercial agriculture characterized by the integration of the different steps of food process, and they're typically large corporations. So the example I have here, the companies own the seeds, they'll own the harvest, the production of that seed and that crop. They'll have the transportation, all under one umbrella. Some examples of that in most developed countries are Dow, DuPont, Monsanto. And you guys know as a STEM school that one of our options is biotechnology. Those of you interested in biotechnology, these are likely some of the companies that you may find yourself working for one day if you're interested in agricultural development. They are the companies that would produce much of that development. Just to see what that looks like, though. Here in the United States, the growth of agribusinesses means that we have reduced the number of farms. If you have these large-scale farms, and those are very controversial in their very nature, the concept that we have these enormous corporations that own a lot of our farmland and our farms, and our seeds, no less, that you can see the red dot, it represents a decrease in a farm, and the one blue dot is representative of the increase. And so you see that there's been broad stroke generalization. We got a large decrease in the number of farms. That isn't to say we've decreased our yields. In fact, our yields continue to go up. But we have decreased the number of farms because they're being consolidated, put together into single farms. So what are the key differences between subsistence and commercial agriculture? Subsistence agriculture, this chart might be a good idea to even pause and put this chart directly in your notes with, on the left-hand side, key differences. The purpose of the farming is different. In subsistence agriculture, the purpose of farming is to eat, is to consume the food. Purpose of farming in a commercial agricultural setting is to sell that, to sell those crops off of the farm, to feed the rest of the world who are not farmers. The percentage of farmers is very different. In subsistence agriculture, the majority of the people are going to be involved in the farming process, whereas in commercial agriculture, the farmers are only going to represent a minority of people. So, for example, in the United States, only 4% of our labor force is involved in agriculture. 4%, that's a very small number. That's even being reduced down to for even smaller numbers as the technology increases, but that's a marginal part of our population. Machinery. In subsistence agriculture, it's mostly done by hand, whereas in commercial agriculture, most of the farming is much of the farming is mechanized, meaning it's using machines. And I also got to make a quick note here. There's a very common misconception that in most developed countries of the world, particularly in the U.S., that farming is somehow done by backwards or uneducated people. To be a modern farmer, particularly in a commercial setting where you're using large-scale technology, that requires a precise and comprehensive understanding of, as I mentioned before, biotechnology, agriculture, farms. I mean, these are really scientific methods. So we can kind of break down that stereotype of Farmer Joe, who doesn't know anything, who's uneducated. In most developed countries, farmers are actually highly skilled, really scientists, for lack of a better term there. Size of the farm. In subsistence agriculture, farms are very small. They're feeding a small group of people, whereas logically, commercial farms are quite large. In terms of the relationship to other industries, subsistence agriculture is largely isolated. So in other words, you're producing the food and you're eating the food, game, set, match. Whereas in commercial agriculture, this is highly integrated with other businesses, and it's even part of a global economy. I'm sorry, economy is cut off there. So it's highly integrated. So I already mentioned this. Agribusinesses are going to be connected to transportation companies and shipping companies, not just within one country, but globally. Agribusinesses are going to be working closely with the government to make sure that policies are friendly to the production of food and the sale of food. So commercial agriculture is really a large-scale corporation, much like other corporations that come to mind when you think of big business. A map just simply showing us the percentage of the labor force that's engaged in agriculture. This largely follows the concepts of most developed countries, developing countries, and least developed countries. You can see that we have in sub-Saharan Africa, 50% or more of the population in those countries is directly involved in agriculture. See that as well in China, most of South Asia and Southeast Asia. And then we have Western Europe. We have a much smaller percentage of the labor force involved in agriculture. This here is farmland per tractor. This is interesting. You'll notice that the amount of farmland, this is a better representation of population in many senses, because here they'll come those densities, the agricultural density and the physiological density that's available in a particular region. And you'll notice the United States has a lot of farmland, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we grow a tremendous amount of grain, particularly wheat, that we ship out to the rest of the world, which you see down below. This connects back to our climates, because despite what I just discussed here, I basically just pitched it as if LDCs are subsistence agriculture and MDCs are commercial. That's a broad strokes generalization. I mean, for the most part, that's accurate, but it's not entirely accurate, because climate, above anything else, is what dictates, not above anything else, in conjunction with development, in conjunction with money, dictates agriculture. So we can make some claims about what happens in an LDC versus an MDC, but we need to remember that it's not just about money. Money is not the only thing that dictates what grows where. So what really dictates what crops are grown where is a function of climate. The type of agriculture that the country practices, be it subsistence or commercial, that's a representation of the development of the country. This is some of the agriculture regions that are found in LDCs. We got pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence, and plantation agriculture. And we're going to put a star next to that one. Don't worry about copying this part down, because we're going to get to that in more detail in just a second here. So you notice that I have at the top in red subsistence, because you must know the types of farming that are present in subsistence agriculture, or that are representative of subsistence agriculture versus commercial. So I want to make sure that we're constantly framing our understanding of these regions around those concepts. So, starting off, the most common form of subsistence farming in least developed countries of the world, and one of the earliest types of farming, is shifting cultivation. So, shifting cultivation is a type of farming that's largely practiced in tropics, so in the tropical regions. And if you think of the equator, the low latitudes means if you go 20 degrees north, 20 degrees south of the equator, those the number of latitudes, so 20 north, 20 south, 0 to 20. Low latitude climates, those are the areas that are right around the equator. We talked about that when we did the map projections. We referred to that as the equatorial zone. Shifting cultivation is practiced in these tropical regions because there's lush vegetation. It's very verdant. Verdant means very green, very lush. Lots of animals, lots of plants in those regions. Because of that, if you've got lots of dense vegetation, you need farmland, and you can't farm when if you've got tons of vegetation everywhere. You can't farm very effectively anyway. So, shifting cultivation is a type of farming whereby the land is cleared for farming through slash and burn. So the process of slash and burn farming, the land is cleared for farming by burning it. Right. Now keep in mind this isn't some sort of just haphazard light everything up and call it a day. There's a very deliberate process of how to effectively burn down an area of land for farming. Secondly, when that land, those burned crops are going to temporarily provide nutrients to the ground, to the soil that's there, and the people can then farm on that land. So you notice on the pictures here I have the land that is cleared. So once the land is burned and it's cleared, that cleared land is referred to as swidden. The land is now swidden. Um, so the land is burned. We have our swidden plot that we may now farm on, and we're going to farm there for several years. And the time period for how long you could farm on that land is anywhere from 6 to 20 years. It just depends on the area and the nutrients present. So we have 6 to 20 years of farming in a particular area, but over time, the soil is going to deplete. The nutrients of the soil will deplete, which will force people to physically move, to leave the land, and they're going to leave that land fallow for several years, and in order to allow the nutrients to regroup. And fallow, we learned first flip or second flip video. To leave land fallow means to leave it alone, to leave it untouched. So clear the land, burn it, slash. I'm sorry, that was an incomplete explanation of slash and burn. Slashing down, of course, is just simply cutting down the trees, cutting down the vegetation, and then burning the vegetation that's there to clear the land. So slash and burn, farm there for several years, and then physically move to a new space, leaving the land fallow to replenish itself. Now, shifting cultivation is diminishing. Right, so in the modern era, it's being replaced with something called cash cropping. Cash cropping is when these farmers are being employed by companies to sell very specific plants or vegetation for sale off the farm. So in other words, sorry, there's a bell. This cash cropping would be that if a farmer grows one specific specialty crop that they can then export in order to gain money. So the problem with this is that there's several advantages. The farmer is going to get more money theoretically for doing so. But shifting cultivation it was primarily a communal task. It was sort of the entire community would come together. And now what this is becoming is more individualistic farming, which is not in its nature not necessarily a problem, but is changing a lot of the ways of life in some of these mid-latitude regions. Moreover, it's causing some people to become quite wealthy and causing greater divisions between the wealthy and the poor. This is actually an FRQ question, and you can see here that they're on the left for all of the reasons why shifting cultivation is being diminished. So just to briefly go through this. Moreover, in addition to what I just said about it being changed in favor of cash cropping, there are other reasons. We have more technological advancements that are being exported to LDCs, such as the green revolution technologies. We got hybrid seeds, better synthetic fertilizers, pesticides. That leads to higher yields, and that leads to people to staying in one place because as opposed to having to physically move around. With more and more expanding and growing populations, shifting cultivation simply isn't producing enough food to do so. And moreover, that's leading to if there's expanding and growing population, we need more food and there's less land available to us because people are now occupying that land, so people can't practice shifting cultivation because there's nowhere to go when they need to move. The development of commercial agriculture, this is what I was speaking about when I was talking about cash cropping, that there's profit motives. It's more profitable to participate in cash cropping than it is to practice shifting cultivation. And then the last one I'm going to touch base on is just competing land activities. For example, ranching can often be more needs land. It can often compete for space and can often be more profitable. Another type of subsistence farming is called pastoral nomadism. Pastoral nomadism. Pastoral nomadism is the breeding and herding of domesticated animals for subsistence, for eating, for living. So breeding and herding of domesticated animals. So we mentioned already when we talked about agriculture that agriculture isn't just about producing a crop. It's also about herding animals. And this is practiced in arid and semi-arid, dry and somewhat dry areas of the world. Talked about this last class when we looked at the climate zones. Makes perfect sense given that there's poor soil quality. So for that example of the Bedouins who are largely in the Arabian Peninsula, that if they can't farm, then they're going to practice pastoral nomadism and they're going to raise animals and trade those animal products for profit. Animal products and animals themselves for profit. One of the things that these pastoral nomads practice is called transhumance, and transhumance is the seasonal migration. So these pastoral nomads will often seasonally migrate between the cool highlands in the summertime and then the lowlands, the warmer lowlands in the wintertime. So that's just kind of a connection back to our migration unit. The seasonal, cyclical migration of these pastoral nomads is known as transhumance. Third type of subsistence farming is called intensive subsistence agriculture. Intensive is a term that's used just like you would say intense. Intensive is a reference to the amount of labor that's being exerted. That's being put upon a particular area of land. So intensive agriculture is one where there's a lot of labor and a lot of effort going into a small plot of land, whereas extensive agriculture take that same amount of work and divide it over a very large area of land. So for example, intensive subsistence agriculture involves maximizing the yields of small areas of land. So if you've got a growing population, such as China, for example, I shouldn't say growing. You have a large population in China, a growing population, let's say in India. You have a lot of people and not a lot of land. India is huge, but as we have more and more people being born, we got 9 billion by 2050, then you're going to need to find better ways to utilize the land that you have in order to feed that population. That's largely what's happening in many areas of the world, particularly in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. So, for example, these terraced rice fields that you see here in the Philippines, the terraces help maximize all of the available land area. If you practice crop rotation, which we already talked about, rotating which crop is grown on the fields at which time, that can ensure that you don't exhaust the soil from using the same plant over and over and over again. Crop rotation, you're rotating the crop. You are maximizing what that particular area of land can produce. Double cropping. Okay? Double cropping is when you have 2 harvests per year, so you plant twice. That puts extensive pressure on the land, but you're getting double yields. So crop rotation helps to sustain the land and sustain the nutrients. Double cropping actually puts a lot of pressure on the land because you're trying to get 2 different yields, 2 different harvests per year. Wet rice farming, which is what you're looking at as well in these terraces, is another way to maximize your yields. And let's talk about how. Where did that go? There we go. Okay, so here's an example of double cropping. Okay, double cropping is when you're trying to get those 2 yields per year. So one, you might plant soybeans in one, and you might get cotton in another cycle in order to get yields twice a year. There's also an example. What I just gave you too is also an example there of crop rotation. You could just use the same crop twice to double your yields. Crop rotation is when you actually change the yield. So the key example of intensive subsistence agriculture is wet rice production, which is what we see largely happening in China. Step 1 of this. The land is cleared using animals, so that's different from shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation, we clear the land by burning it. In wet rice production and in intensive subsistence agriculture, specifically wet rice production, the land is cleared using animals, which we see here. Step 2, the cleared field there is flooded, so it can either be flooded through irrigation, so bringing water in from somewhere else, or from rainfall, so just allowing the rainfall to build up. That flooded field is called the sawa. There are a lot of people, you notice I crossed out paddy. A lot of people incorrectly call these areas rice paddies and rice, but that's an incorrect use of the term. This flooded field that's now ready for rice production is called a sawa. Now, rice doesn't have to be grown in water. Rather, the rice is they start to grow rice on dry land. So you see in that bottom right-hand picture, you see that people are taking rice seedlings, the beginning of the rice, and then putting this into the flooded field. What that does is that helps speed up the growing process. Thus, we've exerted a lot of work in a small area of land in order to maximize the yield. This is a practice of intensive subsistence agriculture. Lastly, we have plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture, you see I wrote subsistence, commercial, and I'm going to explain why. It's a little bit of a question mark here. Plantation agriculture is a lot of what's taking the place of shifting cultivation in these tropical climates. This is agriculture that's performed on a large farm. So already we see a difference with the rest of subsistence agriculture. It's a large farm in these tropical and subtropical climates that specialize in monoculture. Mono means one, monoculture, which is the production of a single crop for sale. I've already set you up to understand that part of the problem with this is that we have one crop being grown in the same area of land over and over again. So that's problem one. But problem two, which is a lot of the reason why people criticize plantation agriculture, is that it occurs in the LDCs, which are most of the mid-tropical countries, or largely, not all, but LDCs or developing countries. But those crops are being sold to MDCs. So here's where we see that tension I discussed. With those farmers are getting more money, but we're having this division within the country itself. A lot of people say this is disempowering the local economies. It's benefiting MDCs more than it is the LDC itself. And a lot of people argue that this is a loss of biodiversity. We don't have as many crops if one single crop is being grown. This is cash cropping. This right here is the cash cropping I was speaking about before. So that's the criticism. Okay, this video is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, so I'm going to skip through this part and we'll make that part of the next flipped video. So I'm going to take off this question number 6 and we'll answer that for the next round. And here are your analysis questions then for part 1 of how does agriculture vary over space. Thanks, guys.